Okay, in this video I'm going to go through a code review of a Spring Boot application I've written for Postgres, the Postgres database. And I have it up on GitHub, and you can see on my screen I'm at the project repository on GitHub. So if you go to my ID on GitHub, which is Spring Framework Guru, and the repository is /spring-boot-postgres-example, and you'll get the complete source code for what I'm about to show you here. So I'm going to switch over to IntelliJ where I have the project up and step you through this little Spring Boot application I've written for Postgres. Now, the first thing that we see, we're going to take a look at the JPA class. And this is a typical JPA mapping. And I've set up an ID, description, price, and an image URL. So just a sample product. So it's basic Pojo, no big mystery here if you're familiar with JPA. The mapping, we're doing a generation type of identity for this, so auto generation. Now the next thing I want to take a look at is the repository. Now I've set up a product repository, and this extends out the CRUD repository from Spring Data JPA. Now if you're not familiar with Spring Data JPA will provide an implementation of this interface for us. So it will implement the repository pattern, and what we're going to do is leverage this so we don't have to do much with as far as working with entity managers and whatnot. That'll all be managed by Spring Data JPA. It's actually a really nice project from the folks over at Spring. Now, I like to use a service, and this service is going to get injected into the controller, so this will obscure the repository pattern from the controller and allow us to do anything that we need to do between the controller and the Spring Data repository. Now, you could do this inside the controller, not something that I like to do. I like to keep all the business logic in a service layer and keep my controllers fairly light. Now, this is my implementation of the service, and we can see that up on line 16 there. I've annotated the class as a service, so when Spring Boot does its component scan, it'll go through and wire up this class. And now this class does have two dependencies. One is the product repository, which we just looked at. The next is product form to product, and that is a converter class. So I'm following a command object design pattern here, and I'm binding the form properties to an object called product form, and this product form to product is a converter to switch it over to the JPA class of product. Now, you can see my implementations for CRUD operations here. I have a list all, that'll give us all of them, a get by ID to pass in the ID value, a save or update, which will do exactly what it says, save the object, and then delete option. And then I also have one on line 54, a save or update from the product form, where we'll convert it over from the product form. So just a little helper method there. So let's take a look at the controller. And here's the product controller. And you can see there on line 27, I am auto wiring in the product form, and that is the converter. And also on line 32, I am auto wiring in the product service. So I am using setter-based dependency injection there. And line 36, we can see that I am doing a request mapping of the root directory, and I just simply redirect that over to the product list. So when we go to the root of the web application, we'll get redirected to the list. And you can see I've got other options there for show, edit, creating a new product. And then down there on line 68 is where I will take in the save or update from the form. And then finally on line 80, I've got a mapping to go in and delete a product. And all these here correlate to Thymeleaf templates, which are in the template directory. So quickly take a look at the list. And here's the Thymeleaf template for the list operation. And we have other templates out there for product form and show. And if you're new to Thymeleaf, I do have a complete course on Thymeleaf called Mastering Thymeleaf. Be sure to check that out if you want to learn more about Thymeleaf. And let's take a quick look at application.properties, and this is where we're going to get into some important stuff. Line 5 is the data source URL, and this is what's going to tell JDBC where to find the database at. So I am saying for Postgres that I want to go to localhost port 5432, which is the default port for Postgres, and then to the database Spring Boot DB. And that's important to have your database map there. So you're going to change this based on whatever database you are connecting to. And in my case, I have a username of Postgres and a Postgres at 123 for the password. And those two values, of course, you are going to be setting to your specific values. Now on line 8, there's the Postgres driver. We need to set that as well. In 10 and 11, these are things to keep the data source alive. So if you have an application and you're not doing a lot of activity to the database, your connection can get smacked down. And what this does is go out and do a select from the database to keep that socket connection up and alive. And a handy thing that we can do here on line 16 is to show the SQL. So we can get to see the SQL logged out to the console, and this is handy for our debugging. Line 19, for Hibernate, we are doing a create drop, and this is going to recreate the database each time. So this is fine for development. Definitely not something that you would want to do in a production database. I typically run validate with a production database, which is going to validate the database schema in production against my JPA mappings, and if something's wrong, the application will fail to start. Then we are using the most recent version of Spring Boot, which is the 1.5 series, and in Spring Boot 1.4 and 1.4 higher, we are using Hibernate 5, and we got some new naming strategies. And on lines 22 and 23, these affect out how Hibernate names the tables and columns based on our JPA mappings. And then finally, we want to set the Hibernate dialect for Postgres SQL, and that is done on line 26. Now let's go ahead and take a look at running this. You see here I've got the Spring Boot Postgres application. I'm just going to click run here, and this will start up. It does start up pretty quickly. You can see that Spring Boot is running, and we did get a little bit of a SQL logged out here. So we can see the SQL generated by Hibernate to generate our table. And now I'm going to toggle over to Chrome again, and let's do a refresh. And I shouldn't have any data there. So brand new database. Now if I come in here to create new product, some description, call it 12, some URL, and submit that, and we can see that this has been persisted to the database. If I come over here, go back to the list, now we can see that, and let's edit, and let's do a 333 on the description just to change it, submit it, and we can see that that changed on the show screen. Let's double check the list. And we can see that the 333 there is present. So that has been persisted to my Postgres database. And just as a quick reminder, if you do want to get this project on GitHub, go to Spring Framework Guru /spring-boot-postgres-example.